Hello everyone, good afternoon again. It's me, Megan, and Pond. Pond is going to help. And by help, I mean lie in the background and look adorable and probably clean himself. So, the last time I did this, which was on Monday, all that time ago, I enjoyed it very much and everyone else seemed to enjoy it very much. So I thought that we should do it again. And actually, Josh suggested that I do a live stream talking about my research because we feel like everyone knows what he does, because what he does is really interesting, and Sumerian is cool and Hebrew is cool, and there's a lot of scope for like interdisciplinary videos with the Hebrew, especially, and the stuff he does with Skylar, because that plays into biblical studies quite well. What I do is, I think, honestly, less cool. I really enjoy it, but it's probably not as interesting to as many people, so I don't talk about it as much. He's going to listen to this later and tell me off for being so mean about my research, but that's okay. I'm allowed to be mean about it. It's my research. So today we're going to talk about Megan's research. I'm also going to eat some tangerines because I realized about 10 minutes ago that I hadn't actually eaten breakfast yet. No, lunch. I had breakfast, didn't have lunch yet. But before we get going, we have a question already. HNIW says, you teach so many ancient languages, that's awesome. How about ancient Maya or ancient Chinese? And John Kobu responds, I don't think that's included in a Assyriology PhD. Yes, it would be super awesome if we could teach ancient Mayan and ancient Chinese. Unfortunately, neither of us have any training in either of those languages, so we would not be able to. It's probably something that we could do if we found someone who's a specialist in Mayan or Chinese studies. And actually, that's not a bad idea for the expansion of the channel in the future. But it's not something that Josh and I would be able to do ourselves. I mean, we could do it, but it wouldn't be good and it wouldn't be responsible scholarship. So we will not be doing that personally. But if there's anyone out there watching who knows ancient Mayan or ancient Chinese and feels like teaching a YouTube course on it, email us. We'd be very interested in collaboration. Sorry, I'm peeling my tangerine. Yes, that would be pretty cool, because then I could learn ancient Mayan as well, which looks like a really interesting thing. Yeah, that would be really cool. So thank you for that comment. Long story short, we won't do it. If we find someone who's interested in teaching that, then we will look into it further. Okay. What does Megan do? And I've just realized that everything I own is binging at me because while I have turned off notifications for the computer, I've not turned them off for the iPad. So you're getting a bing every time anything happens on my media stuff. There we go. Okay. Oh, we have another comment, Richard Wood. A contrast in time against other existing civilizations would be interesting. That's actually a very good idea. And actually, when I was an undergraduate, that was one of the things I struggled with the most, because I did Mesopotamian history and Egyptian history, and also Greek and Roman history, kind of all at once. And it was really, really difficult to keep track of what was going on in the different geographical regions at the same time. I've tried a little bit to provide something like that in our timeline. I'm not sure where I put it, though. We have an interactive timeline somewhere on the internet that I will look at, because I know it exists, because I made it. Sorry. Now someone's asked, I must track it down. This will take 2 seconds. There we go, comparative timeline. Let me see. And this is very much a work in progress. If you have things that you think should be added to it, actually that would be really, really helpful. So if you read that and think, I'd like to know where this historical event is on that particular timeline, then leave a comment or email me and I will do my best to add it to our timeline so that everyone knows what's going on. But that probably should be its own video, or a video in its own right. So thank you for the suggestion. We always like suggestions. They're always interesting. They're not always possible, but they are always interesting. So that was a very, very long, rambly introduction. I appreciate everyone's patience. I ramble quite a lot. If you're watching, please like, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. That will be very helpful for us, as we are trying to raise money for a scholarship program. I'll talk about that later. I think most people watching probably already know about it. So, Megan's research. What do I do? If you've watched enough of our videos, you will know that I work on royal inscriptions. But Megan, I hear everybody cry. What is a royal inscription? A royal inscription is a text that is inscribed upon an object, and the kind of object varies quite widely. And they are either commissioned by a king or commissioned by his family or occasionally a third party. And these inscriptions vary in topic quite widely. You can have just the name of a king inscribed on something, and that is enough to count as a royal inscription. Or it can be a record of the king's deeds, notable events in his reign. Sometimes they'll include curse formula, so along the lines of, if someone in the future raises this inscription or places their name on it, may the gods cut off his seed, destroy his progeny, generally stop him from becoming famous and amazing. So royal inscriptions are really, really, really ubiquitous. They are everywhere in Mesopotamian history, from the early dynastic period, which is like 2900-ish BC, all the way through till the Sargonic era. Now, I don't work that far in the future. I like that I'm considering the Sargonic era the future. For me, the Sargonic era is really quite late. My dissertation focuses on the early dynastic through to the Old Babylonian period. So that's like 2900 through to 1595-ish. And I'm looking at all royal inscriptions that have been translated by a publication series called, imaginatively, The Royal Inscriptions of Mesopotamia. So people have got together and found all of these inscriptions, then they've collated them and translated them and put them in a big series of books, which is really, really cool. I'm going to break there because we have a question. John Kobu, what do likes get you? I thought you need cumulative viewing hours and subscribers. We do need those things, and we actually have enough viewing hours and subscribers to get monetization. We're just waiting for YouTube to review our channel. But likes help in that they boost our video ratings and they boost our channel ratings. And with some kind of weird YouTube magic, it means that our output is suggested more often to new viewers and returns more highly in searches. So likes do help. Viewing hours and subscribers are absolutely fantastic as well. I don't quite understand how it all plays together, but I know that it does. So, right, royal inscriptions. So these can be inscribed on, like I said, a whole range of objects, including foundation tablets, which are little, usually stone tablets that are buried in the foundation of temples and palaces and other buildings. On bricks that are then built into temple walls, but also things like statues and stele. Hammurabi's law code, the stele that's on, that would be considered a royal inscription. The Gudea statues, if you're familiar at all with Gudea, he's a king who had a whole bunch of statues made that represented himself, and they're very often inscribed. So those are considered royal inscriptions, even though they're on giant statues. Vessels like bowls, cups, jars, if they have royal inscriptions on, that's totally legitimate. And yeah, loads and loads of stuff. And actually, some of the inscriptions are known only from later copies. So what happens in the lifetime of an inscription is that they're set up, especially the statues and the stele, are set up in public locations, usually within the temple. Well, I say public locations. They're set up often within temples. How public that would have been is quite hotly debated. Some people say actually the common person would not have been allowed access into the temples. Other people say, well, areas of the temples would have been open for people just to wander in and out of. We don't really know for certain. I hope I'm right in saying that. It's a little outside what I do, so I could be wrong. But these statues were set up, and then we have evidence that scribes would visit the statues and copy down their inscriptions. In especially the O3 and the Old Babylonian periods, a lot of the scribes would go, they'd copy inscriptions, and they'd actually write down sometimes where the inscription was located geographically, also what it was put on. So if it was on a statue, they'd say on a statue of King Sargon, and then sometimes they'd also tell you where on the king's body it was the inscription was put, which is really, really interesting. So you have a lot of inscriptions that are not known from firsthand, especially the inscriptions from the Sargonic period. That's about 2333 BC to like 2113. So these inscriptions, we don't have the originals, but we have later copies on school tablets, on scribal exercises. So we can know, even though we don't have the originals, we can know with some degree of certainty what the inscriptions said and what these inscriptions were put on, which is really useful for me, because one of the things I'm trying to do is reconnect inscriptions and inscribed objects, which may seem like a bit of a weird thing to say. One of the things that happened in Assyriology quite early on is that there's this weird divide between archaeologists and Assyriologists. So archaeologists work with material culture, things that you pull out of the ground. Assyriologists traditionally just stick to the text. So people write down the text, they copy it out, and then they translate it. And a lot of the time they don't, or at least they didn't, this is changing now, a lot of the time they didn't necessarily care much about what objects these texts were put on. And that actually makes quite a lot of difference. There's a mythological text called Error and Isham, which we've talked about a few times on the channel. That's a long poem. It's really interesting. And one, or I think actually two of the sources we have for this text are actually amulets. They're not just found on clay tablets like you would have maybe in a library copy, or it's not like the books that we have today. These texts often were thought to do things. So the Error and Isham extracts that are written on amulets were intended to protect against the plague. And until you look at what the text is written on, you don't have a full idea, you don't have a full picture of exactly what the purpose of text is. So what I am trying to do is kind of reconnect royal inscriptions with inscribed objects. So looking at what kinds of themes and topics were chosen for inscriptions, and if there's a connection between those themes and an object type, and also where an object was found, because that obviously plays a massive role in archaeologists understanding the purpose of these objects. And unfortunately for early excavations, this information just doesn't exist. Early excavations were much more like treasure hunting. Archaeologists would dig at the highest part of a site, because that was where the temples and the palaces were most likely to be, and the temples and the palaces were most likely to contain the big impressive sculptures, precious objects. And as a lot of archaeological expeditions were funded directly by museums, and still are, the museums wanted their like excavation teams to bring back things that they could display. And the things they wanted were the big impressive statues and precious objects and all that kind of stuff. So what happened a lot of the time was people would go and dig, not necessarily record an awful lot of information about where things were found. Like they might say it was on this tell, on this mound, but they wouldn't say maybe what building it was in, or if they said what building it was in, they wouldn't say what room it was in and what else was in that same room with it, which is actually really important in determining what an object is used for. If you have, for example, a vessel in a grave surrounded by a bunch of other vessels, that tells you something about what that vessel was used for. But if that same vessel, or not the same vessel, obviously, but if a similar vessel was found in a temple context, maybe in a storage room with other vessels, or sometimes buried beneath the floor of a temple, those three things tell you very different information. You've got burial goods possibly intended to sustain the deceased after death. That's not really a big Mesopotamian thing. I'm just using lots of examples. That's more of a Egyptological thing. But you've got vessel filled with maybe beer intended to sustain the deceased after death. If you have a vessel in a temple, that might represent storage, maybe it's tax, maybe it is intended to pay the priests who live there, maybe it's intended to be given to the god as an offering. And if you've got a vessel buried under a temple, that tells you something else. That tells you maybe that this vessel was important, it was sacred somehow, and couldn't just be disposed of after it was no longer useful. You couldn't just throw it out on a rubbish heap. It had to be disposed of in a ritualistic setting very carefully, because it's an important object. So if you don't have that information, if you just have a vessel that was found on a mound somewhere, it's quite frustrating because you lose an awful lot of information. I'm going to break there. We have some questions. HNIW, is there any new archaeology in Iraq? When was the last one? There are archaeological projects ongoing in Iraq. I can't give you an awful lot of detail. I'm not an archaeologist. It's not something that is really on my radar, but I know that archaeological excavations are happening. One of our professors at Johns Hopkins was excavating in a region called Kurdistan for the past few years. I don't think he's been back recently because of the political situation, but he was there a few years ago. There is also another excavation at, I can't remember which site, but one of the big southern Mesopotamian sites is being excavated. Why does ancient Mesopotamian literature have so many long repetitions? Clay is quite heavy. The repetitions are, I believe, just literary style. And you see it throughout an awful lot of mythology and literature. And that's probably why you've asked the question, because you've listened to some of our literary videos. It's just how they compose texts. It's probably speaks to the like the literary sensitivities of the time. Like, we don't do repetition so much because we think it's boring or it's redundant. It doesn't sound right to our ears, but that was quite a common thing. I can't give you a better answer than that, I'm sorry. Yoboots1 says, the Guardian Science blog had some great articles from an archaeologist excavating in the north and the south. Oh, cool. I'll have to look at that if it's still up. That's really awesome. But yes, excavation is still ongoing in Iraq. There was, until the Syrian civil war, a lot of work being done in Syria, also in Turkey, because Mesopotamia kind of extends quite far north. It's not just Iraq. But yeah, lots of work still ongoing, lots of work still to do. And it's difficult. I mean, apart from the political situation, it's very expensive to excavate, and you don't want to excavate too much, which is a little counterintuitive, but you don't want to dig up everything a site has to offer, because archaeology by nature destroys what is there. In order to get to the very first layers of a city, you have to destroy everything that's on top of it. And that's just how it goes. But it means that if we excavate a site in its entirety, we don't leave anything for future archaeologists who potentially have who definitely will have better and different technology than we do. So we want to leave something behind for future generations to study, possibly in less invasive manners. Chris says, do you know how many versions of the Atrahasis flood narrative have been discovered? I actually don't. I will make a note of that and ask Josh if he has any ideas. How many tablets of Atrahasis? Yes, I do not know, I'm afraid, but we can probably find that out for you relatively easily. Okay, where was I with royal inscriptions? I was talking about find spots. So find spots is the information that tells you, surprisingly, where an inscription was found. And it doesn't always exist. It can be very difficult to get hold of. But in some cases, we are very lucky. And we do have that information, especially with more recent excavations, which are much, much more scientific and less of a treasure hunt. But even some of the earlier ones, the excavations of ore carried out by Leonard Woolley, actually have a surprising amount of information preserved. And I'm going to put a link into the chat. There's a wonderful website called the Online Project, which actually has digitized all of the dig records, all of the notes, all of the books, all of the data that we have. And given this stuff is spread across 3 museums, they're in Philadelphia, London, and also in Iraq, in Baghdad, it can be quite difficult to get hold of all of this. And they've done it for us, which for me is really, really useful because a lot of my material was excavated at ore. So it means that I can go to this website, type in the excavation number of a specific object, and get a relatively detailed report of where it was found, what it was found with, what room in what building, and sometimes whereabouts in that room, which is great, and I love it. That level of information does not exist for everything, unfortunately. But what I am trying to do is kind of combine all of this data. And it's not really been done before because there are so many royal inscriptions. Like I said, this is something that occurred throughout like the entirety of Mesopotamian history. Kings made inscriptions, recording their deeds, recording their names, writing to the gods. So we have a lot of stuff. And normally what happens, sorry, YouTube doesn't like it when people swear on the live chat, and I really am not bothered by that at all. What happens is that scholars take a small proportion of this corpus. They look either at one time period, so they'll look at the early dynastic royal inscriptions, or they will look at inscriptions found on statues, or maybe just inscriptions from one particular city. Which is really, really good and really useful work, but it means that we can't actually get a good picture of the whole tradition of royal inscriptions and the practices that like change and vary through time and also through space, because like I said, Mesopotamia is a huge, huge, huge area, and the inscriptional practices in the south are not necessarily the same as inscriptional practices in the north, and to view them as homogeneous is actually quite irresponsible. So what I have done is I have made a ginormous database that contains information about the inscriptions, including like names, personal names, what period that inscription is from, what toponyms appear in the inscription, what divine names appear in the inscription. So I have one like database section for the inscription. I have another section for the objects, the inscribed objects, including like the excavation number, so people can go and track it down, what the object is, what it's made of, if I have access to that information, what dimensions the object is, like how big and small it is, whereabouts on the inscription, whereabouts on the object the inscription is placed. And then I have a final section of the database for find spots. So if I have that information, where an object was found, what it was found with. So massive, massive database, which means that I can handle all of this data with relative ease. It's certainly easier. In the past, it would have been a case of manually collating all of this and writing out different entries and then having to rifle through it and find the information I'm looking for instead of just searching a database using keywords and search terms. So I have this massive database, which is amazing, and I love it. And it lets me look at trends and patterns in the data that can be quite difficult to find otherwise. So I can look at what proportion of inscribed objects are bricks from the early dynastic through to the Old Babylonian period, and see if bricks are more popular in one period than another. And also in conjunction with that, look and see if those bricks have the same kinds of inscriptions throughout time, or if the kinds of inscriptions vary by king or by chronological period, or by region. And it's really interesting because you can see these patterns and things like things that people have, like academics have noted but not necessarily been able to back up concretely. it's really easy to check that kind of data out. So in the early dynastic period, there's a lot of building inscriptions, which are traditionally viewed as inscriptions that commemorate the construction of a building. Whereas the Sargonic period, which comes after that, is the kings are much more concerned with military conquests. So people have noted this and said, well, the early dynastic kings like to talk about buildings and the Sargonic kings like to talk about military stuff, but it's been quite difficult to quantify. And with my database, I can actually quantify that and say, that's right, actually. As it happens, Sargonic kings are much less likely to talk about building activities than they are to talk about military accomplishments, which tells you something about views of kingship in those different times, and maybe the roles and responsibilities of a king as they change through time. So I really like it. It's awesome. It's awesome. And one of the things that I'm doing at the moment, I actually gave a presentation yesterday at my university, just like a dry run to practice. I'm giving a talk at one of the big conferences in November. So it's our university policy that students present to faculty and the other students before going public with something, just to get feedback. And what I've done is I've taken a set of inscriptions from the early dynastic to the Or3 period, and I've put them through a topic modeling program. And topic modeling, very simply, is an algorithm that tracks like underlying themes and topics in textual data. Yeah, I'm not going to go into that in more detail because partly I can't, because I'm not a programmer, and partly we just don't have enough time. It would take me a long time to adequately explain that. So I've run all this stuff through a topic model, and what it's produced is really interesting because it gives it shows links between inscriptions, and again, it can show chronological change in inscriptional topics, and how these things change from time to time, and what remains a constant throughout the whole period. And one of the things that always comes up is a royal titulary, which really wasn't surprising, because one of the main purposes of royal inscriptions is to preserve the name of a king. So like King Sargon, King of the Four Quarters, King of the World, all that kind of boastful rhetoric is known as a titulary. Yes, it contains the word tit. And this titulary is the only thing that is in existence in all the chronological periods I'm looking at, and in almost, well, yeah, I'm going to say in all inscriptions that I've read. I'm going to stop there. We have some questions. 0132 is this database something all archaeologists use? Surprised I've never heard of it. No, it's not. It's something I constructed. It's a database I use, a program called FileMaker Pro. And when I've finished my dissertation, I do want to try and make it available to everyone. I'm not sure how to do that. But no, it's not something everyone uses. It's just something that I have on my computer that I spent a year plus making. YoBoots1, do you use specific software for analyzing or visualizing the data? Not really. I use, like I said, FileMaker Pro lets me search in different fields of the database. For visualization, I'm pretty backward. Really, all I use is Excel. I put this relevant data in there. FileMaker Pro has a visualization function, but I can't get it to work properly. So I've just been transporting the data that I need and using Excel to make pie charts and spreadsheets and stuff. HNIW, is Mesopotamia more obsessed with sexuality than other civilizations? I don't know, and I don't really know how you'd quantify that. I wouldn't say so. They have a lot of there is a good amount of erotic literature. There's a lot of erotic metaphor, but I don't think it's more prevalent in this culture than in some others. But again, I don't know how you'd look at that. certainly considering things like Greek mythology, my impression would be that there's a comparable amount of sex in there than when compared to Mesopotamian myth. I don't think it's a particularly notable difference. Yeah. So we've covered royal inscriptions, we've covered topic modeling. And actually, one of the things I want to do with my topic modeling stuff is try and evaluate how scholars, how they categorize these texts. So you've got royal inscriptions as a genre are very broadly defined as inscriptions commissioned either by a king or by someone on behalf of the king during his reign. And then you have subgenres, things like building inscriptions or military inscriptions or votive inscriptions that are quite often categorized by scholars on the basis of the terminology used in the inscriptions. So, excuse me, if we're thinking about Sumerian inscriptions, one of the classifications or one of the categorizations is building inscriptions. And in order for an inscription to be considered a building inscription, generally speaking, it has to include the verb do three, which is Sumerian for to build. In contrast, if an inscription contains the verb ru, which means to dedicate, then it's a dedicatory inscription. The problem is that we don't know whether these classifications are would have been recognized by the people who wrote the inscriptions, partly because we don't have anything like a library system that that groups them together at all for us. The grouping is entirely done by modern scholars. And there is also a problem in that sometimes inscriptions can fit into more than one of these subgenres. So there's an inscription that contains both the verb do three and the verb brew. So based on the classification system that we use currently, that is both a building inscription and a dedication inscription. And I think that using this binary classification is actually quite misleading. I think it flattens the data that's available to us. I think it makes the inscriptions too simplistic. And then when you have something that contains markers for two different subgenres, you have the problem of, well, where do you put this? Is this a building inscription, or is this a dedication inscription, or is it something different? Or is it not really relevant? Should we be considering these inscriptions as a continuum or a set of themes that can be put together in different ways at different times, rather than discrete things that can be put into a categorization box, as it were? So Chris Baker says, do you find in your studies that words translated day in English that in the Semitic language family use the same word to mean different frames of time? That would be a question for Josh. Honestly, I suspect you're asking about Hebrew and the word yom. I know he's talked about that before. And I honestly don't know. Not without doing some research and looking into it. Sorry, if you want to ask me about kingship, I can talk about kingship ad nauseum. Semantics is not really my thing. But if you leave a comment and ask Josh about it, he will get back to you on that. I'm trying to think of what else I was going to talk about. I can't quite remember. Oh, I remember. Ha, that was easy. So Royland's, can you tell us the story of deciphering the cuneiform script and reconstructing the Sumerian language? Yes, but not right now. That's something that I need to do, but that will require a significant amount of research to do responsibly. It's on the list, though. It is coming up. We just need the time and the energy, really, to find the right resources and make a decent video of it. Christopher Schroeder, can you talk about kingship then? I can. Let me finish. No, let's talk about kingship now. That works. So Mesopotamian kingship. And again, Mesopotamia covers a long chronological period and a very wide geographical region. So talking about anything that is Mesopotamian should be taken with some caution, because things vary through time and through space, and what I am saying now is not going to be applicable to all time and all places. It's a very general idea about kingship. So that having been said, kings were, in many respects, kind of like the high priests. They were considered to be the conduit between their mortal subjects and the gods. Oh, sorry, someone's at the door. I will be right back. And I'm back. Sorry about that. I'm back. Kingship. Yes. So kings, very, very generally, and again, different for times and places, were the conduit between the common person and the gods. We don't know an awful lot about the religion, like domestic religion, what the ordinary person would have believed in, how they would have worshipped. What we really have is just like the official state royal religion. But what that tells us, and again, this is all stuff presented by the kings, so they may exaggerate certain things, they may leave certain things out, but the king was the conduit between common person and the gods. They were the high priest of the state religion. They were responsible for carrying out the will of the gods. They were put in place by the gods. So a lot of the time, if you have someone that is not king by normal dynastic succession, the king, the Sargonic king, appropriately named Sargon the Great, his name is actually Sharukin, which means the king is legitimate, tells you he probably wasn't a legitimate king. But the fact that he became king was viewed as evidence that the gods chose him to be king. The previous king did something wrong or was not performing in the way he should. So the gods decided that Sargon should be king instead and gave him the impetus or the resources to then take over. So you have this idea that kings were not only responsible for carrying out the gods' wills, but were also divinely, I was going to say divinely inspired, but that's not quite the right word. They were chosen divinely, like by the gods, to rule in their stead. So exactly what the responsibilities of the king were is interesting. They were responsible for looking after the people, ensuring that justice was carried out, especially with, if you look at Hammurabi's stele, the purpose of that is to show that Hammurabi is a just and a good king, and that he's doing the god's will by making sure that all these legal pronouncements were just and righteous. So kings had to maintain order in their kingdom. They had to protect the weak. You have reform texts that talk about how in previous times bribery and corruption was rife among the administration, among the bureaucracy, and the king came in and basically swept the board clean and stopped the corruption and restored the correct order of things and provided for widows and looked after orphans. Sorry, that's the door again. Sorry, everyone, we're having some repairs done on the house, and the woman doing the repairs needs a power outlet, and they weren't working. So I'm back, and I was talking. Right, reform texts talk about how the kings protected the weak and restored just order to things. So the reform texts I'm thinking about are from the early dynastic period, so quite early in Mesopotamian history. And then you see this carrying through because the law code of Hammurabi is quite a lot later than those law codes. So this seems like this theme of righteousness and just rule is definitely something that carries on through a lot of Mesopotamian history. You also get, as I was saying earlier, some differences. So we go back to the early dynastic tendency of recording building works in comparison to the Sargonic kings who would record their military activity. And then later kings, the Ur-3 kings who ruled about 2112 through 2004 BCE, they went back more to the building idea of like the kings as a builder. And you have something similar with King Gudea, who constructed all of those huge self-representational statues. And these are different, I think of them as different expressions of piety. And they're probably regional differences. So the early dynastic kings and the Ur-3 kings are generally from the south of Mesopotamia. The Sargonic kings are much more a northern rule. So you have these geographical differences where the kings in the south are much more concerned with building temples and building city walls. And a point that's often made about the building projects is that even when kings aren't building temples, if they're building city walls or building cities, this can still be... I'm sorry. I'm back. I'm so sorry. This is going to require substantial editing. Sorry. And where were we? We were talking about ideas of kingship, and the, oh, right, awesome. Sorry, we have someone doing work on the house, and they needed help with, oh, hang on. Apparently we just got monetized. I promise the cat is alive. He is very still, but he's sleeping. So I promise he's alive. And Josh just texted me and said that we got monetized. We did! Oh, well, that's really exciting. Oh, wow. What a thing to have happen live. Digital Hammurabi is now monetized. Oh my goodness. That's amazing. That is completely amazing. Well, thank you, everyone. We're monetized because of you guys, because you watch all our stuff and subscribe, and you're just generally awesome. Oh, wow. That's super cool. That is so cool. So, oh, that's exciting. Okay. Sorry, I was talking about kingship, wasn't I? I was talking about kingship. But that's just so exciting. Amazing. This means we can do stuff like buy more books to make into videos for everybody and put money towards our scholarship program. Yes, I think we're going to have a celebration tonight. So exciting. Okay, I know we have a couple of questions that have popped up. I'm going to just finish the whole building versus military ideas of kingship first, and then we'll move on to some more questions. So to recap for myself, mainly because I had to go and do things, kingship in the south is often characterized by building projects, kingship in the north, and the baby's awake. Gracious me, this is just not working today. And we're back. So kingship in the north is characterized by military endeavors and by expanding the rule of Mesopotamian gods. You can't eat that, silly. That's a tangerine. You're too small for tangerines. Sorry. Say hi. Is characterized by military endeavors, while this southern kingship is much more involved with building works and building activities. And as I was saying, even though a lot of the time the building activities that kings commemorate are not necessarily religious, they're not temples, so viewing them as piety seems weird. The whole city and really the whole country was understood as the territory of the gods. So by working on a city, by improving a city's infrastructure, you were indirectly performing a service for the gods. So, sorry, he's very happy. So even though you have what we would consider public buildings being restored, being built by the kings, this was still an expression of piety on the king's behalf because they were enhancing the god's domain. In contrast, the northern city, well, the northern dynasty of the Sargonic kings, and also the Neo-Assyrian Empire had some of this focus as well, were much more interested, at least to judge by their inscriptions, much more interested in expanding their territory. So going and campaigning against other cities, creating some kind of empire, and recording that as a pious deed done on behalf of the gods. And what you then see is, especially in the Sargonic period, spoils of war are then dedicated at temples, gifts for the gods as thanks for a successful campaign. So two very different expressions of piety, but two expressions of kingship that are still intricately connected with the idea of the kings as instruments of the gods and divinely chosen rulers. So that's Mesopotamian kingship in a very small nutshell, I'm going to try and look at these questions without flashing the whole of the internet. Okay, let me just see. Questions. HNIW asked, when did I decide to become an Assyriologist? Relatively late, actually. I went to art school. I did a 1-year art course, and then I did 1 year of a jewelry degree, which was awesome. I learned how to do silversmithing stuff and set stones. And then I realized that while I loved the practical aspect of what I was doing, it didn't fulfill me in a way that that history and that reading and writing had done at school. So what happened was I went to an open day at a university with my sister, who was looking at doing a history degree. So I went to the open day and sat through like an introductory lecture in ancient history and was absolutely fascinated. And I just loved it. And it sounded fascinating and interesting, and it was what I wanted to do with my life. So I kind of thought it over for a couple of weeks, and then I applied to switch degrees and switch universities. So I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Birmingham in ancient history, which involved doing classics, Egyptology, and also Assyriology. And initially I wanted to be a classicist. I did classics in high school, and absolutely loved it. Loved the architecture, loved the mythology, loved the history. So I wanted to go into classics. But then during my undergraduate dissertation, I ended up doing comparative mythology, looking at Mesopotamian and classical myth, and comparing the two and looking at points of contact. And my advisor was an Assyriologist, and he basically said, why do you want to be a classicist? Hey, you're fine. Why do you want to be a classicist? There's so much more stuff being discovered in Mesopotamia. We really need good scholars. And I thought, oh, I didn't think that. I thought, why not? There's so much left to uncover in Iraq, and it's a really exciting field to be in. Because excavations are still happening. We're still discovering new texts, new cities. I think it's amazing. And it was kind of at that point. Hi, you're very noisy. It was kind of at that point that I decided that Assyriology was something I wanted to do. Hi. He's going to try and climb over me now. So I did my master's again at Birmingham University in Near Eastern Studies. I did my first year of Akkadian and Sumerian, and loved it, and decided that I really wanted to do a PhD. And there isn't an awful lot of funding for humanities PhDs in the UK. There's not a lot of funding anywhere, but there's almost none in the UK. And I couldn't afford to pay myself, to do a PhD in the UK. So I applied to a number of American universities who have generally better funding. Oh, thank you. And I was very lucky, and I got a place at Johns Hopkins. And they fund you for 5 years, which is amazing. Not perfect, because no one ever finishes in 5 years. Like 7 or 8, maybe 9 is the average for my department. But it was a hell of a lot more than I'd have got if I'd stayed in the UK. So yeah, that's a long long answer to the question. Let's see what else we have. Thank you everyone for the nice comments. Yes, the cat definitely moved. He is alive. It's all good. Yo Roots 1, do you think the increased focus on building activity in the south is related to the need for extensive irrigation and water projects? Maybe. There's definitely a sense that in the south you needed, like there's an idea that the temple economy grew up because you needed that level of cooperation. You didn't necessarily need it in the north because they can subsist on rainfall agriculture alone. What are you doing? He's looking at his feet. It's very important. But I think the reason that the kings of the All-Three dynasty kind of came back to this idea of the king as builder is possibly more related to them finding justification for their rule in their relation to the previous early dynastic kings. What happened was the early dynastic kings ruled city-states, mostly in southern Mesopotamia. Then southern Mesopotamia was invaded and incorporated into the Sargonic Empire by Sargon the Great and his dynasty. And we know that the Southerners were not terribly pleased about being incorporated into this dynasty. There were countless revolutions that had to be put down by the Northern kings. And when the Sargonic dynasty finally fell, you have like a period of uncertainty, and then the All-Three kings can consolidate their rule in the south and then take over the north as well. But they appear to have traced their right to rule back to the original early dynastic kings. So I think what they're doing is going back to what for them is the traditional mode of kingship, rather than adopting the mode of kingship that would have been seen as the northern invasion, the northern invaders idea. So they're gaining legitimacy through tradition rather than like an older tradition than the one that they've been subject to, rather than modeling themselves after the Sargonic kings. Richard Wood, which civilization invented suburbia? When that idea is threatened, wars start. That's a good question. Certainly in Mesopotamia, you have like a main city, and then when you have what is often called by archaeologists a lower town. So the main city has all of the civic center stuff, the big fancy temples, palaces of officials, administrative buildings, and the lower town is thought to contain much more in the way of people, residential districts, also manufacturing districts. So I'm not sure they would have understood necessarily suburbia, but there was definitely like an urban sprawl. Thank you, to some extent or another. Deborah McMillan, Megan, did some of the gods walk physically on this earth, in your opinion, from what you studied? No. I have found no evidence for the gods being physically present. Hi. The Mesopotamian people thought they were physically present. They could inhabit cult statues. They were like present in the stars and in astral bodies. Hi. But no, I don't think they were physical, actual deities. It's possible that in some cases, some gods were originally people that were, hi. Yes, thank you. I need those to see. Oh, good. Well, I'm not sure I can find my glasses now. There they are. In some cases, it's possible that a god may have originally been a person that was made into a god as their lives kind of faded into legend. Gilgamesh is one example of that. He's a literary figure, but most scholars do think he was an actual king. And later on, he becomes worshipped as a god. He's not one of the big main city gods, but he's still considered divine. You do also get some limited royal divinization in Mesopotamia. It's not something that occurred in the same scale as Egyptian kings. The Egyptian pharaoh, I believe, is definitely he's a god. It's how it is. Pharaoh is a god. You don't get that sense in Mesopotamia, but occasionally kings would be worshipped as divine after their death, and very occasionally they divinized themselves. Naram-Sin, one of the Sargonic kings, issued a proclamation that he was now a god and should be worshipped, which is, I mean, I should do that. I appreciate the need. Yoboots 1 follow-up. So is the whole hydraulic water empire considered out of date or no longer a great explanation for development of urbanization in Mesopotamia? I don't know. I don't know if it's out of date. I think it definitely played a massive role. Definitely played a massive role in the development of urbanization, because you need that many people to manage the fields, to cope with irrigation needs. Yeah, I don't think, I mean, maybe water as the only driving force behind urbanization might be out of date, but it's still definitely considered an important part of it. DLJ, I'm trying to guess your accent. Home counties for sure. My guess, Berkshire. Home counties, definitely. I'm from Buckinghamshire. I grew up just outside of Aylesbury. Deborah McMillan, one of the reasons I ask is because of all the artwork statues they have of the Anuna gods. Yes, but just because you can depict something doesn't mean it was physically present. The prohibition against depicting gods in like the Muslim religion, in Islam, and the aversion that Christians seem to have in actually depicting God, seems to me to be relatively new. Because you have the Greek and Roman gods depicted all the time. You have Hindu gods depicted. All of the Egyptian gods are depicted. It made sense if you're going to worship something, you need something to worship, so you create an image. The whole Christian aversion to graven images is relatively recent, I think. There. Oh, thank you. There we go. This is the day of being vomited on by a baby. Yeah. Do we have any more questions? We've been going just about an hour, and even with the brief breaks in discussion, so you could stare at my cat. I don't have anything else to share, but if you have questions, then please go for it. DLJ, you're very welcome for the answer. Buckinghamshire is lovely. It's a very beautiful part of the world. It's a very expensive part of the world as well. So, hi. Do we have questions, or are we all good? Oh, such a sad and shouty baby. Look at this shouty baby. Oh, ginormous child. He got his flu shot on Monday, which was deeply traumatic for everybody involved. No, he's going to look at his feet some more. It's amazing how fascinating feet are. I never knew. HNIW, why didn't the ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians travel far away? I think they did travel quite far. I mean, you have people from Mesopotamia going to Egypt. That's a ridiculous distance, especially if you don't have things like cars and air transport, and there's no direct route over water either. You can travel part of the way by water, but a lot of it is like a road march. So I'd say that they did travel. Well, thank you. He's giving me kisses by sucking on my chin. Yes, I love you too. And you also have a whole trading colonies from Mesopotamia up in Turkey. And again, that's like a 6-month journey by donkey. So I think actually, given their transportation, they did travel quite a long distance. And there's some evidence for people trading with the Indus Valley. Whether they went directly there, I can't say, but there was contact between those regions. And there's also contact between the Aegean and the Mediterranean, like Mesopotamian areas. So yeah, I think they definitely traveled an awfully long way. Bastian Wolfhart, if Jimmy cracked corn and no one cared, why did they write a song about it? I don't know, because people are weird. Let's go with that answer. People are weird. HNIW, do you know any Hittite? I don't know any Hittite. Yeah, really don't know any Hittite. I've been meaning to get a Hittitologist on the channel, though, if that's something people would be interested in, because it seems something that is very, very interesting. And Anarchy the One, well, guys, that is Megan's personal opinion. Everything I say is my personal opinion. In many cases, it's my personal opinion backed up by a decade of research and scholarship. But yes, this is all my personal opinion. If you disagree, you are definitely very welcome to do your own research. I recommend you do your own research with whatever anyone says to you, no matter their qualifications, because we are all human. We can all be wrong. Yeah, I'm definitely not claiming infallibility here. Nell C. Oliver's helmet looks like something by Jack Kirby. I don't know Jack Kirby, but thank you. I decided that he couldn't have a boring helmet, so we do rainbow swirls. His sister is very upset that I haven't decorated the rest of this. She keeps telling me that he needs violet and pink on his helmet. And she's quite right. Quite right. Akos Eris, walking places takes forever, guys. 1 mile feels like 100. It's not a fast process. Shannon Gilly, if the translations of Sumerian are so vastly different, how are the names of the gods and people the same? I don't think the translations of Sumerian are vastly different. I think you can be pretty consistent with translations by reputable scholars. Our understanding of Sumerian has changed significantly since it was first deciphered. So there are differing translations for the same texts depending on when in time they were translated. But I wouldn't say that that Sumerian can be translated in vastly different ways. There are always going to be differing opinions and varying nuances depending on how you understand the grammar. But no, I'm not sure that I would agree with that. Joe Kombu, names have less grammar. Yes, you're quite right. If you're not translating complicated grammatical features, it's a lot easier to get it consistent. Deborah McMillan, I appreciate your answers, Megan, because of your research and schooling. Thank you. That's why we do this, because we have the background. We've been lucky enough to have the education that we have. So we want to share it with people. Nelsie, I'll have to look up Jack Kirby because I'm a fan of Marvel Comics. Thank you. Yoboots one, how was Shulgi read as Dungi though? That's just a misreading of the sign. And that's related to the changing understanding of cuneiform. Woolley excavated and translated that stuff relatively early in Assyriological scholarship, and just got it wrong. Yeah. Ada. No one reads Shulgi as Dungi anymore. Hi. The thing is, with early translations, there wasn't a lot to go on. We didn't have a lot of information, and as more tablets have been excavated, as more work has been done, we get access to more and more information. So we get more scribal tablets that equate Sumerian words with Akkadian words, and because we understand generally Akkadian better than Sumerian, that gives us an extra nuance in what the Sumerian should be translated as. So every new bit of information brings us closer to a more and more accurate understanding of ancient society and the texts that we use to reconstruct that society. Okay, it is 2:43. Unless we have any more questions, I'm going to go because my child is going to start melting down soon. Yes, I know. He would like to go and play. So, hi. Yes. Thank you all very much for joining me. This was lots of fun. Thank you for your questions. As ever, they're fantastic, and I very much enjoyed them. Yes. Oh, wow. It's 2:43 a.m. DLJ, go to bed, dude. That's reasonable. That's insane. Thank you for staying up and talking to me. That's pretty awesome. Yes, so I am good. Thank you all for joining me. We will do this again. Probably. Oh dear. See, this is what happens when you don't nap. He was in his crib for 40 minutes and was just standing up and bouncing up and down and not sleeping, and he needs to sleep because he's so sleepy. Akos Eris, is there a celebratory stream tonight? I don't know. I feel we should probably do one, but because it's Halloween, we've probably got plans with the kids because our 5-year-old is very excited about Halloween. I will talk to Josh and see what our plans are and put something out on Twitter if we are going to do something. So I'm going to go before he starts screaming. Thank you all for your time and for your patience and company. This was lots of fun. If you have any extra questions, leave them in the comment section and someone will get back to you. Bye, guys. Oop.